Where's my line? I got it. What's my motivation?
Line. I'm sorry, what?
I love the sport of boxing, and one of my favorite aspects of boxing is its deep-rooted history and culture, much of which most people don't know about or talk about. So today, I'm gonna drop some knowledge on you with 8 famous people throughout history that you probably didn't even know boxed. I'm Tommy Duquette, FightCamp co-founder and trainer, and former US national boxing team member, and you're watching FightCamp 360, where we dive deep into boxing culture throughout history, past, present, and future. Let's talk about the OG, Lord Byron, regarded as one of the greatest and most scandalous British poets, author of the book Don Juan. But he was actually bare knuckle boxing since his early childhood. Lord Byron spoke of boxing regularly for his physical health, but he even lauded the benefits of boxing for mental health way back in the 1800s. So here's an excerpt from Lord Byron. He said, "Today I have been very sulky, but an hour's exercise with Mr. Jackson of pugilistic memory has given me spirits and fatigued me into that state of languid laziness, which I prefer to all other." Excerpt from a letter by Lord Byron, talking about that languid laziness that we all strive for. Now you have Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. You know, if your name starts with the word Sir, you're the man. And of course, Arthur Conan Doyle is a legendary writer, best known for being the creator of Sherlock Holmes. So prior to becoming a writer, Conan Doyle was a physician and served as a surgeon on a whaling vessel in 1880. The story goes that he had brought his beloved boxing gloves aboard, and upon discovering them, the ship's stewards had the audacity to challenge him to a boxing match. He was one of the first members of London's National Sporting Club, founded in 1891, and held boxing matches in his own garage. When police deemed an upcoming prize fight that he was hosting illegal, Conan Doyle spoke out in defense of the match in an interview by the British newspaper Daily Mail entitled "Boxing as a Sport," in which he said they can't stop boxing, they will only drive it underground. He incorporated boxing throughout his writing, including several short stories like Rodney Stone, The Croxley Master, The Lord of Falconbridge, and The Bully of Brockus. Pretty hardcore, Conan Doyle, I respect you. And then of course, there's one of my favorite authors, my favorite author boxer, the great Ernest Hemingway, who lived from 1899 to 1961. He's a Nobel Prize-winning American writer, journalist, and adventurer, and having discovered a love for boxing at the age of 16, Hemingway was said to have used his mother's music room as a gym where he sparred all his friends. I can relate with that. I used to use my basement. Those poor kids, I was actually in a gym training. They would come to spar, it wouldn't go well. As a young man in Paris, he worked as a sparring partner for professional fighters to earn pocket money, though many fighters saw Hemingway as an overly confident guy at best. They say he wasn't that good. Hemingway thought he was awesome. He has this famous quote where he's like, "My writing's okay, but my boxing is everything." When we talk about Hemingway's writing, his short story 50 Grand was all about boxing, and the main character of his first novel, The Sun Also Rises, great book, was a middleweight champion. And also many people say that the short novel, The Old Man and the Sea, is sort of a metaphor, an allegory for a guy. He's an old fisherman, he's kind of washed up, but he has this one last great fight left in him. It's really a story about an aging prize fighter. So it's really cool when you think about The Old Man and the Sea in that way. All right, now for all the artists, musicians, and actors, starting with the great Miles Davis, who lived from 1926 to 1991. So he was alive when we were alive, many of us. Miles Davis became enthralled with boxing as a young boy growing up in East St. Louis, and he would nurture that connection throughout his life and career, often drawing parallels between music and boxing. He met and befriended one of boxing idols, Johnny Honeyboy Bratton. This was his boxing idol. And after returning to New York City, Davis trained at the iconic Gleason's Gym. He asked the trainer there, Bobby McQuillan, to teach him what he called the swivel, referencing the torque that Bratton would put into his punches. So he would say, "Bobby was teaching me Johnny Bratton style because that was the style I wanted to know. That style was smooth. Boxing's got style like music's got style." That's what Miles Davis said. Davis was asked to compose the soundtrack for a documentary film about the first black heavyweight champion of the world, Jack Johnson. The film was called Breaking Barriers. Now, I would say that Jack Johnson was the first heavyweight champion of the world, because you can't really call anybody else a heavyweight champion until everybody was able legally to compete for the title. So Davis threw himself into this work, this Breaking Barriers documentary. The fight manager and the film's director, Bill Clayton, said of Miles, he would discuss boxing with this intensity and this passion that you couldn't imagine. Davis's tribute album to Jack Johnson was released in 1971 and is considered one of his crowning achievements, linking his two greatest loves of boxing and jazz. Dean Martin, 1917 to 1995, the legendary entertainer, singer, actor, comedian. Before he was an iconic entertainer, Dean Martin was a school dropout who worked several different jobs before trying his luck at boxing. Martin was an amateur boxer who became a welterweight at the age of 16. He fought as Kid Crochet, what a nickname, and reportedly held a record of 25-11 as an amateur. And when asked about his boxing career, he jokingly said that he had won all but 11 of his 12 bouts. So Martin barely made enough money to afford tape for wrapping his hand and suffered many injuries in boxing, including a scarred lip and a broken nose. That's the way it is in fight sports. It's very difficult to make money unless you're at the very top, which probably explains his transition into the much more comfortable life of being an entertainer and a superstar. Jean-Michel Basquiat lived from 1960 to 1988. It's a very short life. It's a shame. He was a street artist and a poet, turned neo-expressionist painter and cultural icon. I'm not gonna lie to you and pretend I know what a neo-expressionist painter is. So Brooklyn-born Basquiat used boxing themes throughout all of his work and paid homage to the legendary fighters like Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Robinson, and Jersey Joe Walcott. Basquiat watched boxers like Ali, Walcott, and Louis rise to greatness during his formative years, and this inspired him with their heroism in the face of social and racial barriers. So notably, Basquiat posed with fellow artist and icon Andy Warhol as boxing contenders in promotion of a joint show. He was said to have put the gloves on himself and even challenged fellow painter Julian Schnabel to a sparring match, though the two never really made it into the ring. And when contemporary American art curator Henry Getzauer asked Basquiat what his subject matter was, he responded, royalty, heroism, and the streets. Now let's talk about my favorite historical figure that boxed, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. He lived from 1858 to 1919. Obviously, he's an American politician. He was the former president of the United States from 1901 to 1909. He was also a traveler, a soldier, a conservationist, and a writer. So Teddy Roosevelt was born with severe asthma. A lot of people don't know this about him, and found that strenuous physical activity would help him ease the symptoms. Think about that. This is back in the time when people would drink a gallon of whiskey to cure themselves of pneumonia. These people were built very differently. So later on in life, as a police commissioner in New York, he worked to create more boxing clubs in tough neighborhoods, as he felt that the sport was an effective, healthy outlet for young men who might otherwise get involved in criminal activity. As a kid, for myself, there was a program in my neighborhood that I benefited from, and I can tell you I would not be here today talking to you if it wasn't for that program. I wish there was more stuff like that. Wish more people thought like Teddy Roosevelt nowadays. Other crazy stories to show you how crazy and badass Teddy Roosevelt was. One time before a campaign speech, somebody literally took out a gun, shot him, and hit him. So Teddy Roosevelt kind of got irritated, really fired up, delivered the speech, and then dealt with his wounds after that. Famously, he was also the leader of the Rough Riders in the American-Spanish War. Now, I'm not talking about the famous DMX version of the Rough Riders, but I think, I'd be willing to bet that DMX would have welcomed him into the crew with open arms. Now, Roosevelt reflected largely on his lifelong involvement and love of boxing in his autobiography, demonstrating his unwavering support for the advancement of boxing as a legitimate competitive sport. So here's a quote from Roosevelt. He says, "Naturally, being fond of boxing, I grew to know a good many prize fighters, and to most of those I knew I grew genuinely attached. I have never been able to sympathize with the outcry against prize fighters. The only objection I have to the prize ring is the crookedness that has attended its commercial development. Outside of this, I regard boxing, whether professional or amateur, as a first-class sport." How great is it to see somebody at that position, that stature, to be an advocate for the sport of boxing as a first-class sport. Now let's talk about Nelson Mandela, the embodiment of everything it means to be a fighter. He lived from 1918 to 2013. He was a South African anti-apartheid activist and the first president of South Africa from 1994 to 1999. Nelson Mandela is known as one of the most resilient of fighters, surviving a 28-year imprisonment for his activism to become the first president of South Africa. He was also drawn to the science and strategy of boxing from a young age. That probably explains a lot his resiliency. He would say, "I was never an outstanding boxer. I was in the heavyweight division and I had neither enough power to compensate for my lack of speed nor enough speed to make up for my lack of power. I did not enjoy the violence of boxing so much as the science of it. I was intrigued by how one moved one's body to protect oneself, how one used a strategy both to attack and retreat, and how one paced oneself over a match." Now, while Mandela was running South Africa's first ever black-owned law firm, he made training in boxing a part of his life, even often bringing along his 10-year-old son to be a great role model. He's quoted as saying, "Exercise dissipates tension, and tension is the enemy of serenity. I found that I worked better and thought more clearly when I was in good physical condition, and so training became one of the inflexible disciplines of my life." So Nelson Mandela, among all people, the great leader, recognized the enormous mental health benefits of boxing, and he used it as an outlet for stress. And that's saying a lot considering the stress he was always under. He was convinced that when you met that stress with physical activity, specifically with boxing, it would elevate you outside of physical activity in your everyday life in ways that other things cannot. Think about that for a second. All right, these are just 8 famous people throughout history who have identified the science, cultural, and health benefits of boxing to elevate their life and contribution to society. Now that is what FightCamp is actually all about and what we're trying to do with our workouts and everybody who accesses them. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and we want to hear from you. Which of today's world leaders would you like to see in the ring? Hit me in the comments. Tell me like who versus who. I'm Tommy Duquette. This is FightCamp 360, and I will see you in the next episode.